We're going to start working on the Star Spangled Snowmen, and we're using this star, which is about the size of my hand, so it's maybe 6 inches, and it's just a birch plywood. I've sealed it with 1 coat of multi-purpose sealer and let that dry. Sanded it with a fine sanding pad. I like these little oval ones that are real fine. And then after it was dried and sanded, I put on 2 coats of titanium white. Let that dry and gave it another light sanding just to smooth it down. And so it's a real satiny finish now. We're going to do a watercolor type background on this. And to do that, we're going to use some phthalo blue. I'm using Traditions paint, so if you're going to use deco art, you can probably use something like maybe a Victorian blue. This is kind of a deep, warm blue. And we're going to mix a little black with it to tone it down a little bit. Phthalo blue is a very strong color. So I'm just going to do this on my palette, just a little brush mix. So I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that paint on my palette. You can see how bright, deep blue that is. Then I'm going to pick up just a little touch of black on the corner. I don't have very much. We want to work that in slowly to get that color toned down just a little bit. And the black will just take the intensity of that blue down a little. Add a little bit more. So you can see that's starting to get to be like a kind of a navy blue. Kind of what I think of as a nautical blue. So I'm going to dip my brush in water and soup that up some so we have just a watercolory mix of that. A little bit more. And then since our star is dry, the surface is dry, and I want this background to be kind of watercolor, I'm going to dampen the background. I've got just a spray bottle. I use an old hairspray bottle that I've washed out with hot water and then just filled with clean water. And I'm just going to do a light spritz of that over the star. I don't know if you can see the sheen. So it's just kind of a soft, even coat of water. You can also use just a flat brush and even coat over that if you like. Then I'm going to pick up some of this washy paint on my brush. I'm going to get a little bit of that out. And then just start going around the edges of the star and add some of that washy mixture. And we want the center of the star to stay a little whiter and just keep the outer edges dark. So you can see how that's puddling up just a little bit. So just work that around. And I'm going to take a large mop brush, which is this big soft one, and just start tapping that around the center to soften that where it comes into the white. So there, you can just let that set up and dry. And then if you want it darker after it's dried 1 coat, you can go back and add a little bit of another layer of paint in the same way. Spritz a little water on it, apply a little bit of your washy mixture to it, soften it with your mop brush, and then let that dry. So it may take one or two coats to build, well, I should say 2 or 3 coats to build that up if you want a darker coverage. So I'm going to let this set up and dry. Be sure to wipe your mop brush out. You don't want to put that in water because you want your mop brush to always be really dry. So you can wipe it off on just a damp paper towel if you have one. If you get too much paint on and it starts to dry, use some hand sanitizer. And again, that's an alcohol base. You can put some in your palm of your hand, brush it through, and then wipe it out on a paper towel, and that alcohol will evaporate real quickly. And your mop brush will still be dry. You don't want water in it up in the ferrule that's going to bleed out. If you want to add a little bit more variation to the background, I've got a second coat of this paint on it, and it's still a little damp. I've put some alcohol, this is just rubbing alcohol, in a little condiment container, and I've got sort of a bristle brush that I've put some alcohol on. If I take my finger and splatter that into the wet paint, you'll see it starts creating some little like sparkles or light areas where the alcohol causes the paint to separate. This can be kind of fun on a star background. It almost gives it a fireworks effect. You want your paint not quite dry, but not real soupy wet. If it's too wet, it'll start bleeding back in and filling in. So you have to just sort of find that sweet spot where you can keep a little bit of the texture from the alcohol. If it's too dry, it won't separate. If it's too wet, it just bleeds back together. This is just you can do this or not do it. It's not required. But I just wanted to show you another way to get some texture in your background. And I'm just trying to direct the alcohol in with my finger, the direction I'm splattering it, so it goes into the areas where there's more paint. So we'll just let this sit and dry. You don't want to move it because it'll start bleeding back together. And just blot that alcohol out of your brush. It'll evaporate and dry out in a few minutes. Okay, I've dried my star. You can see up here I had a little puddle of paint, so I just was holding it and letting that run, and it gave me a little dark effect here, which I kind of liked around that top. So, I think I've got all the darkness I want to the background. The next thing we're going to do is add some texture to the background. And I'm going to use a star stencil and some DecoArt Dimensional Effects texture paste. This is a paintable texture paste, so once it's dry we can put paint over top of it. It comes in a little jar, and it's just a pasty, looks like kind of like white paste. And I'm going to take a palette knife and work that up. It's a little stiff when you first open the jar, but I'm just going to smear a little bit of the top of that around. It becomes a little more workable. I pick up a little of that on my palette knife. Take this star stencil, and I'm just going to lay these stars out here on the corners, or the points of the star. It's probably a little too much texture paste. But I'm going to take that texture paste and just, it's almost like cake icing, just smear it over top of that star. And I'm not trying to get it real smooth. I'm letting some little ridges and things show through. And then I'm going to very carefully lift that up, and we've got a star there on the end. Try not to get any on the back of your stencil. So I'm going to go to the next point and put that out. Pick up some of this on the edges that I left. And try to hold that stencil down flat so that it's not picking up and getting texture paste underneath it. And then very carefully just lift that up off of there. And you'll see there's another star. And I'm just checking the back of my stencil to make sure I'm not going to have a bunch of gunk on the back. Come over here to the next one again. I'm going to kind of scoop that back in towards the stencil to the opening. Add a little more. And I'm just swirling it around so it has some ridges and things in it. And then carefully, again, just lift that off. And we're going to go around and do a star on the end of each of these points of the star. These aren't perfect. I noticed on this very first one I did, I missed a little bit of the point. When that dries, I might go back and try to fill that in a little bit. I don't know if I dare go back and try to put this over top of it or not. Line that up very carefully. Go back in and fill my point in. Hopefully I haven't messed it up. Okay, that's a little better. So we're going to let that dry. This dries fairly quickly, so I think in about 10 or 15 minutes it should be set up enough that we can go on and start painting our snowman. So once you've got your texture paste on and you've got it dry, I want you to trace your snowman onto the center with some gray graphite paper. So here's one that I've been working on before that has the stars on it, and I've got the snowman traced down. So trace your snowman and do your stars, and then we'll take up from there. Okay, we're back with our snowman, and we're going to paint him in some reds and blues. I'm thinking of this design as sort of a little patriotic or Americana, since it's called Spangled Snowmen. And we want to keep repeating our colors, so we're going to use the blues that we did in the background, and then we're going to pick up some reds. And you know, of course the snowman's going to be white, so we're going to start with him, and I'm not going to base him in white. We're just going to use this dirty blue background that kind of washed over from the paint that we did on that watercolor effect on the black background, and kind of incorporate that into our shading. So the first thing I want to do is reinforce some more shading, and I'm going to do that with a gray. again, using Traditions colors, and I'm using a dark gray value, and you can mix that by just using black and some white. It's just a simple mix. You'll use probably a little more black than white, but I want you to side load your brush. You can see how dark that is. And I'm just going to come up here and float underneath that hat just to give us some nice dark gray values for his snow under the brim of that hat. I'm using a 1/4 inch angle. You can use a 1/4 inch flat or a 1/2 inch flat, whatever you're comfortable with. And then we're going to also do that, just re-side loading in the same little track. I don't clean my side load brushes very much. I'm going to come down here and side load here under his body, underneath the scarf around his neck. And I usually side load fairly wet. I like that, almost a watercolor effect. The paint kind of smooshes and blends on its own. We can come down where the body is coming out from under the stars. And we can even add a little bit of shading underneath those stars if we want. I am picking up a little bit more water each time, so again, just add a little bit of water to my brush, side loading in that same track, and I'm going to come down here and float along the top of his scarf on his face. Just this is a little bit less intense float, but again, it's just going to kind of separate his face from that scarf. Put a little cast shadow. And don't worry if, it's not perfect. We're going to be dry brushing over top of that. We just want some indication of where the shadows are going to be. Just go back and touch up any you feel like you want a little darker. And that looks pretty good. Now while we're waiting for the floats to dry, you can go and base his hat with white. I do want that to be a little bit stronger and brighter color. No, I'm sorry. Don't do his hat with white. Do the hat band with white and the scarf with white. The hat's going to be the blue color of the background. We're just going to darken that some, so we'll leave that as it is. So put a coat of white on his hat brim and on the scarf. Here you can see I've got just one coat on the hat brim and the scarf. You don't have to make that real solid. This was just kind of a juicy base coat. So a little bit of water, a little bit of white paint. And then I went back and put this indication of little like trails from his scarf, the ends. And I'm just side loading that outer edge and letting that bleed back into the background. There, so you can see that. Okay, let's start working on his face and body a little bit more. I like to stipple and dry brush snowmen, and I usually use some type of round dry brush. There's a lot of different ones on the market. You can use, for instance, here's a Dynasty Series 200 dry brush. That's real nice. I use these Royal Sable, well, they're actually called Royal Sable Tex. These are the synthetic sables that Royal came out with, I think, about a year or so ago. I also will use the Royal Sable Round. These are also by Royal Langnickel, and they're a natural hair brush, which are really nice for dry brushing. And they come in a variety of sizes, but I like the rounds, and this is a size, say, 16 with a longer bristle, and this is a size 8 with the what they call the short round. So use whatever brush you like to stipple or dry brush with. We don't need anything real big for the snowman's face because he's not a really big snowman. So something in the, I'm using, here's, I think I'll use this 8 Royal Sable Tech. And I'm really bad with my brushes, so this has a little paint dried in it, but it should be okay. And I'm not going to worry about the snowman's features. I'm just going to go right over them. We can put them in later. I'm using the brush dry, and I'm picking up some titanium white from my palette on the tip of the brush, and I'm just going to bounce that here on my wax palette. I've got a wet palette over here to the side that keeps my paints workable for a long time. And then once I've tapped that out so the paint's kind of distributed pretty evenly on the brush, I'm going to start tapping on the snowman. And when I first load the brush, I always start tapping right in the area that I'm going to have the strongest amount of paint so that I can work with all that paint that's on my brush, and it'll start depositing, and as I work out farther, I'll have less paint on the brush, and it'll just naturally ease up and get blend into the background. I was going to say lighter, but really not lighter level of paint, or lighter deposit of paint. So, you know, as I start working out here, I'm starting to run out of paint on the brush, but that's okay. I'm just pouncing a little bit harder, and there's still a little bit coming off, but it's going to make that snowman very soft. So I'm actually going right up into that gray a little bit, so I'm going to soften that gray a little bit. So it was pretty strong when we put it down, but since we're going to start stippling and dry brushing over it, it'll soften into the background. Okay, so I can pick up a little bit more paint. Again, tap it out on the palette. And we can start working down here on the snowman's body. Again, I'm going to keep him lightest towards the center of his body. So that's where I'm going to start tapping at. And as I start feeling the brush is lightening up a little bit, I don't have as much paint, I'm going to start working away from that area and go into the shadows. Now I also find that it helps if I keep the tip of the brush with the paint pointed in the direction where I'm coming from, because there's more paint on that end than there is on this end of the brush. And again, it's going to soften back into my shadow colors. This is a very slow, steady process of building up values. But you can see now, you know, we're starting to build a highlight here in the center, highlight in the center of his face, and we've got the shadows going on around the edges. And that's what gives dimension to your painting. So I'm going to, again, pick up a little more paint on the brush, work that into the bristles on my wax palette so I don't have any major globs of paint. And we're going to start back here in the center of the face again and just build up a little stronger highlight. Think layers and layers and layers. You're not going to get there with one layer of paint. And you'll see I'm turning the star as I work so that my paint tips of my bristles are always sort of pointed in towards the center of the face where I want that strongest highlight at. It's not so important once you work a lot of that paint off the bristles and you're not laying down a lot of paint. But when you first have a real load of paint on the brush, you want to keep that paint towards your highlight area. I don't know if you can tell this from the camera, but we're still seeing some of that blue background color in amongst our white and the shadows. And that, really incorporates the snowman into the whole design. So, the background colors are adding to the shading and values in his face. And the more we stipple, the softer his body and the snow becomes. Down here he's a little bit rougher, so we'll go back and add another layer over that. Again, we're starting here around the bottom center where we want the strongest value of white. And I'm going to turn him and start working back more into the darker shadows. But each layer of the stippling that we put on, his snow's going to get finer and finer textured. And don't worry if you get into your shadows too much. If you start losing shadows, you can always go back and side load them back in. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Picking up a little more paint, and I'm going to start dry brushing here in the side of his center of his face. And I'm using the same brush to dry brush, same load of paint, just picked up a little bit more. But instead of tapping, I'm kind of scrubbing it in just in a circular motion. And again, I'm starting in the center where I want the strongest value of paint when my brush is fresh. And then as that paint starts depositing and there's less paint on the brush, I can work around to the edges and soften that into the shadows. You'll find that when you're dry brushing, a lot of times I find that I like when the paint's so dry, it almost creates like a powder on the surface. Then I know I've got a really good dry brush. And again, when I do it on the palette this time, I'm going again in that circular motion that I'm doing for the dry brushing. Start in the center and just radiate out from that center where you want the strongest highlights. I'm going to do a little bit of that down here on his body also. Okay. So again, keep your dry brush dry. I don't like, again, putting water in it, because if you get water up in that ferrule and you try to dry brush with it, that water is just going to seep down and you'll get a muddy mess. So I'll wipe out what I can on a paper towel, and if I don't feel like that's enough, then I can clean it with the gel hand sanitizer to get that paint out, but a lot of times I'll just leave them till I'm finished with my painting and clean them later. The next thing we're going to do is work on the hat brim, and this is going to be red, so I'm going to first base it with Indian yellow, which is a very warm orangey yellow color, and that will be a good highlight color for our red. So I just went over top of that white base coat we did. We're just going to come back and do a one layer of yellow. The hat I'm going to keep similar to our blue background color, but just deepen it. So I'm going to use the phthalo blue. You can see this is a very bright blue, but I'm going to touch just a little bit of black into it to tone it down. So I want to side load my brush with that color. And I'm just going to come and deepen that color around the edges of the hat by side loading it. And don't forget your little extension of the hat up here at the top. I'm just working up on the tip of my brush on this small area. It's just a real wash of color, so we're not putting too much down. And this blue's so intense you don't need very much of it. We'll let that dry and come back with one more coat of that. And I want to keep the same tones for the scarf, so I'm going to again just start adding some shadows on this scarf, which is going to be more white, but we'll use the blues as the shadow colors. On this side I'm going to shade behind the scarf because we've got these tails that are coming up and flying away in the back. This is just a very watercolory wash of color. It's a lot of water, a little bit of paint, so it's very transparent. I'm just softening that out a little bit. I'm going to add one more layer up here on the top of the hat. Working with this little brush, the paint really spreads quickly if you have too much water in the brush. Again, it's the blue plus a touch of black just to tone that down a little bit. This time I'm using a little heavier color to play up those shadows. So you can see our hat's got a lot more intensity to it now, so I'm going to strengthen some of these shadows on this scarf. And I'm not reloading my brush. I'm kind of letting that paint play out so that we don't have so much in the brush, just to keep these shadows a little softer. Now on this side I'm doing what they call walking in that shadow, where I put it out on the edge, and then I start moving my brush in just a little bit towards the center, overlapping those each time, and that spreads that shadowed area, gives it a wider volume. I'm starting to run out a little bit of water in the brush now. It's not wanting to blend in quite so much. So I'm just touched my brush in the water a little bit to give me some more moving power, I guess. This is very washy and transparent, sort of a watercolory effect. Okay, now our yellow should be good and dry, so we're going to go back now and start adding some of the red to it, so that this is really going to be a red brim rather than a yellow brim. So I'm using a color called Naphtha Red, which is just a bright red, kind of a watermelon-y color. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start doing a sheer float of that color, starting at the edges and working that in. I'm pinching the corner out here because I've got a little too much red spreading across the brush, so it's giving me a hard edge here that I want to keep softer. You can see as I'm coming across, I have less and less paint in my brush since I've laid a lot of it down here on the side, so it's becoming more transparent. And we're getting a red glow over it, but we're still seeing the yellow through this, so that's going to be our highlight color. So let's reload the brush a little bit and do the other side. And again, start walking that color in towards the center. And I've got enough water in my brush that this is, again, going on in a very watercolor, washy way, so that it's very transparent. And the paint almost sort of bleeds out because there's so much water in it. So there we've got a good first start. And it'll look a little bit blotchy on the first one, but we're going to do at least probably 2 more layers over top of that. We'll do some stripes on the scarf. So I'm going to switch over to a small flat brush. This is a number 2 flat. And again, we're going to start with yellow, and I just want to keep the yellow stripes in the more center area that's more white. If we go into the blue and I put this yellow over top of the blue, it's going to turn more green. So let's just start right here in the center, and I'm just pulling from top to bottom and just curving them a little bit so they look like they're curving around that scarf, that the scarf's bunched out. This will give it just a little bit of dimension. As I go to the other side, I'm curving a little bit the other direction. and more towards that blue. You can see where that starts going a little bit green. So we'll stop there on the yellow. And this last one we're going to do just in red. Because it's in more of the shadowed area, and we'll eventually want it to be a little bit more of a purpley color. So I'm adding a little bit of water to that red so it's not a little more transparent. I'm going to add a little stronger highlight while this other stuff is drying back to this face. You'll find with the acrylics, after the colors have had a chance to dry and set up, they seem to lose some of their intensity. So I'm going to, again, use the Royal Sable Tech round. This is a number 8. And I'm loading it with some titanium white. And just spreading that in the brush, and then I'm going to come back here and start playing up that center of the face a little more to create a stronger highlight again. And this can be a combination of dry brushing and stippling. We just want to concentrate that towards the center of the face first, and then once we work some of that paint off the brush, we can blend that into the out towards the edges of the face where the shadows are. Okay, that gives us a little bit stronger highlight here. I just wanted to do that before we put our eyes in and the nose. Work this a little bit farther over to this direction. Our yellow's dry, so we can go back and start adding some red to that. And I'm going to side load the brush with our naphthol red, the bright red. And I'm going to just start floating the top and bottom of each of these stripes. And again, this is going to take a few layers to build up some strong values. A little more paint and water to the brush, I start running out. also do that on these darker stripes here in the end. For hat brims dry, we can go start our next layer of red over top of it. You'll notice as each layer of this you put over, your colors are going to get smoother looking. They'll start filling in a little more. They won't look so blotchy. As you work in on this, since, you know, like I said, we're working with a lot of water in the brush, so you get a real transparent wash as we're adding these glazes. You can also, as you come towards the center, if you start getting like a harsh line of paint, you can take a little mop brush and tap that out too. That helps soften. Another technique I'll sometimes use also is to just put a little bit of water down in that area before I start the glazes, and that will help keep that hard edge from forming. It'll stay wet and you can tap that out. So you can see we're starting to get a stronger red on the brim, and we'll do the same thing. We'll keep repeating that on these stripes on the scarf also. Like I said, it's probably going to take at least three floats to actually build up a nice value of red. But we're keeping that yellow glowing through here in the front just to create our highlights. Okay, one more layer of red over the hat brim. And like I said, sometimes I will do a wash of water over this especially the center area, which will help those floats blend in when we get to the center. Just walk that color in. And repeat on the other side. And then right here in the center, I'm just going to soften that out with, my paint's starting to dry. Depends on how fast your conditions, how warm or your humidity levels. Things can set up pretty fast. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to darken the shadows on this scarf just a little bit more. This time I'm using just a wash of black. You want that very washy. You don't, the black's very opaque, so you want to let that wash out to nothing. And we still want to be able to see our blue through that. So darken that a little bit, and we can darken down here on this lower edge. Stop and transfer some guidelines for your snowman's face, and we'll work on that next.